so please be respectful.
And as always, our conversations about art and technology can only occur because of the land that facilitates every part of our lives. We'd like to acknowledge that the land that we are gathered on for this live stream is Treaty 4 territory, the homeland of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Lakota, the Nakota, the Dakota, and the Métis people. You are gathered wherever you might be, and we are honored to be joined tonight by Nathalie Lawhead to continue the conversation about digital art and Flash and archiving. Nathalie, you can take it away.
Okay, so this is me, and I am a digital artist that has been working with Flash since its beginning. I've also been building experimental websites, software, and games since the late 90s, and you can find me here on Twitter, and these are my links. My talk is going to be about my work, but also the historic context in terms of digital culture that all this falls under. It's about Flash games, early Flash work, and how the movement informed what we have in indie games today. The early web was a hurricane of creativity, innovation, and people trying to figure out what a website is and what having one even means. When I got into this stuff as something that I seriously wanted to do with my life, I remember I still had to explain to people what the internet is and what a website is. It wasn't common knowledge. Email was more or less new to many people, and the dot-com boom was going strong, and it was a very interesting type of gold rush of visionaries trying to get companies to invest in the internet. When we talk about that era, we talk mostly about the business side of things, the economy, the crash when the bubble burst. We don't really go over what the era meant for digital art. I think very interesting things came out of that, especially for the artistic expression being explored. I think early websites were an interesting era to examine for how artists tried to take hold of the space too and explore art using the new platform internet and the medium websites. For example, net art was a beautiful concept. The idea that you could use iconography and anything native to computer culture to create art so unique it would confuse people that looked at it. All this was really alien to people at the time. There was no baseline for what this was. Not everyone knew what the internet was, which made it really singular, a bit out of this world. I remember at that time, if you were a net artist or did any type of art based around websites, you would also have to be a salesperson of sorts and be really good at explaining why you're even investing time in doing something so awfully weird. This is also the type of internet era where Flash really took hold. Flash pushed websites further, letting us dream up what we really wanted the web to look like. As early as 1997, people were making experimental Flash websites. I posted a more in-depth summary of that scene on my blog, and you can read that to learn more about that space. The link is in that slide. But the late 90s and early 2000s, is when I developed a serious interest in digital art as something I wanted to do with my life. At the time, from about 1997 into the mid-2000s, websites were being touted as the ultimate new art form. You could be a total nobody and host your work online, and anyone in the world could see it. You didn't need museums or galleries. You didn't need anyone. You had all the power to put yourself out there for everyone to see. All that, along with the interactive format, made it very compelling, unexplored territory. Interactivity meant my work could be something people not only looked at, but also experienced. Either way, that was the appeal that really stuck with me. The early Flash website scene had a strong interactive language. Conversations on why interactivity and combining that with animation were pretty abundant. I know today Flash, and as a result, most of that work or scene has a bad reputation, but at the time a lot of his work was viewed as revolutionary. It shaped many facets of today's digital culture in ways that we don't really acknowledge. I think Flash was always interesting because it started as an animation tool, Future Splash, and eventually grew into an interactive tool. Because of that very broad combination of things it did well, animation mixed with programming, made it a very accessible tool for artists. Even by today's standards, you'll be hard-pressed to find a substitute that does that so well, the convergence of an art tool, animation tool, and a development tool that's also cross-platform and backwards compatible with older work all in one. Flash wasn't just a tool, it was a creative philosophy packaged with a strong development philosophy. It allowed pretty much anyone to participate in this ongoing creative discussion, what websites even are, what they can do, and what they mean as an art form. It allowed us all to ask, what should the internet look like, and give our answer in our own way. I think that what a website means as an art form, part of this is important and kind of an exploration that we lost. My first serious Flash project was born out of a conversation that I had about how would I illustrate poetry, and my idea was that the poetry should be animated and react to the person reading it. This is when I created a website called Blue Suburbia, which was a collection of animated and interactive poetry. I launched the first version while in high school. It was kind of a cathartic project too, because my family had just moved to America during the bombings and war in the Balkans. My family's history is mired with labor camps, fleeing homes to escape the camps, the breakup of Yugoslavia, kind of that type of political drama. My parents worked with refugees, so I grew up with these discussion stories and that background. That's the type of history or narrative that I was very used to hearing when I was growing up. We moved to the US with nothing and slowly worked to build a life here. The culture shock from coming from that and being dropped off straight into American high school was a lot, and working on this art project became my way of coping. This type of art was my way of making sense of the world and finding my place in it. The themes of the poetry dealt a lot with being a refugee, war, poverty, and conflict. I advertised it as being a commentary on the American public school system because I didn't think Americans would understand or be able to sympathize with the themes. The idea behind Blue Suburbia was that each poem was based in its own unique, very animated, very interactive environment. My aim for the quality of the animation was to be something like Disney's Fantasia meets Edgar Allan Poe meets Tim Burton. I was a high schooler, that was my idea of cool. So the project was kind of built around all that. I'll show you some of it to give you an idea. So, let's see, because it's older, you can only scale it above a certain point, otherwise the whole thing breaks. So like this is the opening part, and it's kind of like a random looping animation that kind of sets the tone for what the whole site is about, and like you roll over it and then the poem appears. It's kind of like an introduction, and then you enter it. This also has a lot of sound work in it. Like right now is music playing as the whole intro part is playing out, and it's pretty intricate sound work too, because a lot of it reacts to what you're doing and what you're clicking, or certain sounds are going to play if your cursor is closer to certain areas. So it's kind of like pulling you in to explore it, and all of it is very tied into text. So it's like a different way of exploring literature in a way that's very interactive and reacts to everything that you're doing.
We've shared the link for people, for the audience in the chat if they want to open that up and hear the audio and experience the whole piece.
And then, like, after that, it sets you into this environment, and the whole thing is like a set of environments, and each poem is kind of in its own world, and like you have this, it's very much like exploring a dream, so being in someone's dream. Like there's a key at the beginning, and you know, like, see, it's playing an animation, you go over it, it stops playing, and text appears. I'm going to just show you one of the poems because there's like a lot to this. You could spend a couple hours in it. But like you go travel to it, travel to enter other areas, and most of them have text associated with it that kind of sets a mood. And the point is very much about reading and discovering little pieces of a poem or larger poems.
We might have to refresh your screen share.
We're having a little bit of a lag.
Okay. It seems like it's...
We're not seeing...
We're still stuck on the first screen.
I'll do it. Stop sharing. Just a second. It stopped sharing, is that okay?
Yes, looks like.
Here. I'm sharing just the screen.
There we go.
Nice.
Yes?
Awesome.
Yeah, so I just clicked on the key to go open the map that lets you go to any part of the house here, and I'm gonna just quickly go to this one poem to show you kind of like the idea of how every part of this has different kind of worlds bundled into it, where you explore a poem, which is like the world sets the stage for the poem. And like there's a lot of sound, like right now there's, you know, sound and stuff playing. So this one was called In Rose Bushes, and it's like the scene is all about roses and being, you know, kind of forgotten in this space and watching time pass by. Yeah, so like this is a world that this poem is based in, and you can then click on this and then it will, how text displays the poem, like it's part of an illustration and it kind of reveals itself the closer you get to it. And yeah, so that's like the idea of the project. I won't show more of it, but there's a lot to it, and the environments are constantly changing. And let me change the screen sharing thing now. See? Okay, so that was the Suburbia, and the first edition of Blue Suburbia was posted in 1999. The thing took off like wildfire. It was pretty big and enjoyed a cult following. People talked about it, larger art publications wrote about it, featured it, people reached out to me asking if they could showcase it. A few institutes asked me if they could include it in their curriculum, and really impressive people sent me the resume because their work impressed them and they wanted to work for whatever studio was responsible for it. It was a lot for a high schooler, but this is why I fell in love with this type of work. I think the spaces where it was really embraced were fascinating. It got some nice recognition in net art circles. People used words like literary hypermedia, net art, interactive poetry, hypertext poetry, e-poetry, and so on to describe it. This project grew out of that. Flash made this type of expression possible in ways that aren't really doable or embraced in the modern web anymore. I think we experienced an interesting shift to the modern web from things like this. It was normal to expect this from a website. Today we don't. The internet as a platform doesn't really lend itself to such work anymore, at least not as coherently and seamlessly. Sound and animation don't play well together in such a sophisticated way with modern web solutions. It's a good example to use for how natural and easy it was to do stuff like this complex almost 20 years ago as contrasted to how hard it is today. I think it's interesting how the web has changed to support certain work but completely reject others. Blue Suburbia really took off. It had a passionate cult following. If you look at old JS Games comments on this, you can see the interest it had in this lasted years. I still get emails about it today. The internet gave me anonymity. Working on this project was my secret identity. I enjoyed being the secret artist that made it, enjoyed its success, and nobody really knew that I was just some goth teenager that made it. My friends didn't know that this was something I was doing either. I enjoyed the idea that professors were showing this in colleges like I actually had value and people could learn from what I was doing. This was what I wanted to do with my life, so I pursued web development and interactive art on the web. When I was looking at going to college, none of these places really taught stuff like this. Most of the professors told me that I was wasting my life with this, and that the internet is just a niche that's going to die, and that if I was to continue, I'd ruin my creativity. This type of tension lasted a really long time. Just the concept that this work has value worth embracing is a pretty recent thing. Blue Suburbia stayed with me for a long time. I worked on this project from 1999 and stopped in 2005. I made a lot of weird and wonderful art websites, so here's a few examples of them. And I hope it doesn't hang for you. But they're smaller, so I don't think it's going to be a problem. Oops. Yeah, this one. The interactive FMV breakup letter with this girl to her toy moose plushie. And she's kind of talking about how after 2 weeks of dating, it's over because you're a boring conversationalist. And like, so, like the joke is it's towards a toy. And you explore this breakup letter by clicking on the text here, and she's going to elaborate on it. And it's really cute. It's really like it's high pitched, and there's the song from the opera Carmen playing in the background and really high pitched. So it's like super bizarre, especially with the sound. And if you continue, then you see the reaction from the toy moose, kind of like being brokenhearted and rejected at this. This was like a little flash joke meme web project, and at the end of it, it forwards you to this Blogspot account where you then explore the online life of her, and it's kind of like dark comedy, and it gets more and more bizarre as you interact. And there's this YouTube channel where she's blogging, and it gets super weird, and it's silly. It was a joke character. It was a collaboration between me and my sister. So that was one, and then there was. This was Haiku Forge, and it was like interactive haiku, and this kind of like a piece of paper that you find, and you explore haiku, and there's random sound and visuals and lots of music going on in this too. And you click on any of these, and it'll give you random haiku, the theme of moments lost or time. And And this was my website for showcasing my welded metal sculptures. And what I think is interesting about this example for like a photo gallery of sculptures is that everything is extremely animated. So it's like stop motion to explore these sculptures. And there's a lot of music going on too. So like it shows you different dimensions of the sculptures, and there's little numbers you roll over. It kind of gives a animation to showcase this. So that was one, and that was like 2004. And the last one was my Flash portfolio, which was kind of like an interactive music video. So I mean, like all of these have a lot of sound, and it's definitely more impactful with that. But like music is playing, and everything's animating as you explore the work. And it's all very colorful. Like what I love about this old web stuff is how much of a role animation plays in it in a really intricate and sophisticated way. And websites were all extremely unique and different. So yeah, that was my older work. There's screenshots of that here. So all that gives you an idea for how older web work looked. I think it still holds up to today, and it's a great example of how sophisticated Flash actually was and the breadth of work it empowered people to put out there. I had websites where sound was fully integrated with animation and visuals, and text was treated as more part of an animation than it was just text. It's a type of website that we had space for. This kind of thing wasn't suitable for commercial sites where you would not want it to have it act like art, but it was something that existed in the mentality of the internet. Websites leaning more into being art themselves than just sites. There was terminology that existed to describe this type of website too, like Flash website, rich media, immersive experiences, rich interactive applications, and so on. There were some interesting transitions that took place with the internet and how we relate to websites around the time that social media appeared. Starting with the growing popularity of Facebook, self-hosted sites started to become less popular. As a result, the Flash website or art website started to become a lot more rare. The way we surf the web changed when social media became the norm, so people's interests were streamlined from consuming this type of content, finding and sharing websites, to consuming stuff from social media, finding and sharing discussions, videos, images, all localized on social media. I remember talking to someone that wanted to build an ARG, and he joked that it was rare to find someone that still did work like this because most of his peers that built these sites moved on to making games. I think that captures where a lot of people that did this type of work went. It's interesting to note, too, that many discussions surrounding the Flash website coming out of the website's art crowd involve discussions about interactivity, how interactivity makes art more impactful, how that can make you empathize with the themes more intimately because you're part of the piece, and how these websites were what people loved doing because they merged all the other arts. You had to be good at sound, coding, art, and so on. Discussions like this were extremely similar to discussions that we have in indie games today, but that happened almost 20 years ago with Flash websites. With Flash games, if you look at the type of studios that shifted interest from web development to game development, you see some amazing work having been done. The mentalities that went into making immersive Flash websites were redirected to Flash games. I feel like a lot of that just changed into being games, like these discussions just shifted into the game direction. For example, Amanita Design did incredible work with Summer Roast in around 2003. Their work is still available and gives you a good idea of the level of caliber that you could expect from Flash games. I might have a link to that somewhere here. I mean, it's a YouTube video, but I'll just show it quickly because you probably have seen it if you play Flash games. But you can see how there's a lot of music going on and animation, and the art style looked very different too. And I mean, you can look it up. This is the name. Yeah, so around this time, Blue Suburbia started to, wait, I have a slide. Around this time, Blue Suburbia started to get shared in different circles. The gamer crowd picked it up, and I think that signified an interesting mentality shift for how my work was treated. Discussion around my work changed from, wow, this game is an amazing piece of art, to, lol, this game is weird. I won't get too much into that, but it was really interesting to see just how changing the label from net art to game brought in a lot of confusion and hostility. Eventually, because of how Blue Suburbia was being labeled a game, I decided to start making games, but ones that were extremely non-game-like, kind of rejecting games while still being able to call them games. In 2008, I started Tetrageddon Games, and I have a recording of that being played a little bit. I don't want to run out of time, so I'll just give you a little idea of how it looks. So like the intro starts with an extremely loud soundtrack, and then the monkey blows up the browser, and then there's these Flash games in the middle, and a lot of them were actually developed for the Nintendo Wii because the Wii browser came with Flash, so you could play Flash games in the Wii browser, and that kind of created a little movement of hobbyists targeting the Wii for their games. So like they were all mine were all extremely colorful and loud and ridiculous and kind of very silly experiences. So the original Flash site on that one is still up too. Among the game crowd, my work was faced with a lot of hostility. The idea of what a game is and should be was still pretty Puritan then, with if you did anything different, it could garner harassment. For context, in this slide is this type of gaming experience that generally formed people's expectations when they interacted with this type of art or engaged with games. I talk about it a lot. If you're interested in this slide are links to more discussions on that. My work was extremely polarizing when being picked up under that label game, largely because Blue Suburbia was about reading and just exploring, not about actually doing anything game-like, like defeating or solving things. I think it's an interesting note to make that early Flash games did a lot of similar innovation that we see in indie games today that we think is new. In some ways, you could say that Flash games were the indie game successor. By all accounts, Blue Suburbia was just a really early walking simulator, before we even had concepts of walking simulator and that games can be just about meandering. For better context, in terms of how browser games were growing, I think it's important to examine how the professional Flash game scene looked like, acknowledging just how big it was at the time. The casual game industry grew out of online flash games. The term casual game was kind of coined by gamers because these games aren't really real games, they're just casual. Either way, these games were big enough to inspire discussions about what real games are. This was a huge industry that started to become something to take serious for the amount of money it was making. A lot of people played these games. Sites like addictinggames.com served as portals. We know of Newgrounds, but portals for hosting flash games were a dime a dozen, and many even paid for them. I sold a Tetris clone to addictinggames.com for $5,000 just so they could redistribute it. It was easy to make money with this type of work, especially if you were willing to sell source files. There were sites like flashgamelicense.com where you could sell that. Things were steadily growing. In the slide are links to old Gama Sutra articles discussing making money from this work. What I think is novel about these old articles is how high the revenue estimates are, just being casually thrown around. It's also interesting to note the pushback flash games, casual games in the browser, had from gamers proper, complaining that these were not serious or real games, but people engaged with them the same rate at which they now engage with mobile games. Sites like jsgames.com curated the most interesting flash games and even helped set the stage for legitimizing this type of indie game. There are a lot of correlations for what we have in indie games today that are similar to how curators work to legitimize and curate flash games. I think another interesting observation to make also, especially if you go reading through the links in the slide, is that flash games were a very saturated market, but people still easily made money on them, as compared to current conversations about the indie apocalypse and how indie games are too saturated, and that's why money is not being made anymore. Flash games were able to grow into an industry despite saturation. In my opinion, it was easier to make money from them as compared to today's indie games. So I think these problems go deeper than saturation. I think by getting rid of flash games, and especially the browser-based flash game model, or industry for lack of a better term, we shot ourselves in the foot. Mobile was not a good substitute, and I think it's important to examine why, as well as what the shift from browser to mobile did. You can argue that this space moved to mobile, and now mobile stores are saturated, being very hard to make money from mobile. But the controlled nature of mobile is exactly where the issue is. We had a very thriving, very Wild West space on the internet, and that got shoehorned into two stores, Google Play and the App Store, where things are extremely controlled. There are no alternative mobile stores. Everything either goes through Google's storefront or Apple's storefront, the App Store. Without the alternative spaces or alternative storefronts and alternative communities for distributing this type of work, more life and innovation cannot grow. The mobile space is not allowed to grow outside of the restriction of these two storefronts. Mobile devices are way too controlled, way too monopolized by the platform holders to allow for any of that. Browser games, that entire industry and all the creative freedom we enjoyed, was basically forced into these two storefronts, especially with the loss of the Flash player and desktop browsers, and that pretty much killed the type of momentum we once enjoyed. HTML5 was not able to accommodate that transition, especially if you look at how inconsistent HTML5 support is between the mobile browser and desktop browsers. In many ways, it simply didn't live up to being a complete technical substitute to Flash. I think that and the shift in control that the internet experienced with mobile is a big reason that we lost this industry. For something to thrive, you need lots of storefronts and lots of communities, and for a platform to stay extremely friendly and accessible to hobbyists. Without that, you lose the momentum and cultural relevance. I talk a lot about this in my blog post here, which is really worth reading if you want a history of that change, including how HTML5 failed many of these use cases. Either way, that's the context for Flash games. It's also worth pointing out that with the death of the Flash player, all these sites just died. Online browser games are a shadow of what they once were, and so is that industry. It would almost be a joke to call it an industry at this point, since it's no longer anything major where you can make a living, not the way it used to be. I think it should speak volumes that instead of this industry just transitioning to HTML5 and growing out of that, most of these portals closed or went under with the disappearance of the Flash player. The type of creative momentum we saw with hobbyists and small indie game development largely shifted to Unity and the desktop. Places like itch.io are similar to how Flash game portals were, but the majority of this is taking place out of browser. I discuss a lot of this in my post in this slide, but I think HTML5, the modern web, and the loss of Flash has failed browser games. When I talk about this, I'm often told that browsers are just not meant for games anymore, which I think is a sad loss. HTML5 was supposed to be better, not kill this once thriving scene. When we talk about indie games and build a history about who innovated with them and where the breakthrough indie darling titles happened, we rule out Flash work in our discussion and focus more on the Unity era as the era where games as art fully emerged, which I think is a mistake. Flash developers and artists are responsible for a lot of innovation and laying the cultural groundwork that eventually evolved or transitioned into our current indie game movement. Flash work is unfortunately never really talked about, definitely not as something legitimate. It's largely ignored when building our contemporary history. It is responsible for so much of it, though. It's good to examine how things have shifted from then to now, with the way art games have grown in their popularity. A lot of people that used to fairly violently oppose work like this have embraced it, and these quirky not a game games. The games don't have to be fun games. Autobiographical art games, vignette games, and so on are pretty normalized now. This evolution from websites being art to weird experimental web games to experimental games now being much more embraced is an interesting one to track, especially if you look at it as a single line instead of separate unrelated movements. I think Flash has actually done a lot for what we have now because of how accessible it was. These ideas grew very fast, and they were shared much more easily with our everyday computer user because the Flash player was so common in every browser. The way walking sims received blowback was very similar to how my experimental work received blowback. I think, in context, it helps to understand all this if you view Flash as being, for lack of a better term, the predecessor in the game movement. Like I keep saying, Flash set a lot of the groundwork for what indie game is today and how accessible we expect developing games to be. Even in the early version of a walking sim that you worked like Suburbia was, what played out later with games like Dear Esther or Gone Home seems similar to me. Stuff like this works in reiterative cycles where the same idea eventually catches on and finally sticks. I think the way these experimental digital art models, like the art website, found their way into indie games today is an important tangent to follow for how these things never really go away. They just find different spaces and terminology to exist under. Today, I still view websites as capable of art, something also meant to be experimented with. I think we lost something vital when we standardized the web and kind of stigmatized that type of experimentation in websites. These mentalities that a platform belongs to everyone and should be accessible to anyone's vision for how it can look, behave, and what it can be for are important. For example, you can argue that Unity is proprietary too, but most of our art games movement is built on it. What would happen if Unity suddenly made very bad decisions and was singled out for deprecation by larger corporations interested in pushing their own solutions so they may control a platform? The same arguments used to attack, criticize, and kill Flash can be used on Unity too, any platform really. You can certainly call JavaScript slow, unstable, buggy, or a security risk. For example, Unity is a proprietary technology. The engine is closed source. It does not run well on everyone's machine. It is made by a commercial entity and not nonprofit or open source. You could complain that Unity games are buggy and look ugly, and there's a potential security risk if you're willing to go that far. If Unity were used for banner ads, then it certainly would come under that fire. Too many games use Unity. The majority of them look amateurish. No, I don't believe any of this or that it should be held against Unity, but these are arguments we readily make about Flash without really thinking about the implications of what we are saying. You can say all this about a lot of tools or technologies. You could basically slander Unity and as a result our hobbyist game movement to death. With how readily we repeat stuff like this, it would not be hard to stomp it out in such a way that it would not even be worth preserving or remembering because it's just so bad. The subtext here is that game development should be left up to bigger corporations capable of making good games, the same way as we now view websites. The exploration is gone. It's about following a certain set of standards that you do not deviate from. Being welcoming to amateurism matters for a lot of reasons. What happens to a tool when it's very accessible and everyone can make things for it? How does it make a tool look when anyone can create so easily, put stuff out there? It will get a bad reputation for being a certain way, when that should be attributed to the technical shortcomings of the developer, not the tool. Many misconceptions about Flash were a result of developers not really bothering to implement things like disability concerns, usability concerns, designing for search engines, but this is because of lack of technical knowledge, or because developers didn't care to make that work. Flash did have a set of standards that many followed. The platform is haunted by misconceptions and negative PR. If a tool and platform is free to everyone and becomes so popular, it will eventually suffer from misconceptions about how bad it is because of the poorer quality of work. I don't think this is something you can control or really should standardize either. If everyone has a right to create for a platform like the web, then you will have bad work. The internet should support all the varying types of creativity and voices. There will always be a push and pull, but it matters that space is held for amateur work and the power is not completely surrendered to monopolies or larger corporate commercial entities. A space cannot be run or controlled entirely by big players, otherwise the creativity dies. This is basically what happened to what we once had with Flash. Websites have become very mundane, templated things where if you step out of design rules and do something different, you will get lectured on not being user-friendly. We've become so stale we don't really expect more or allow them to be more than just a pattern. I think it's important to look at that for what it can mean for games today. It would be similar if we suddenly saw a technical shift in indie games, with accessible tools coming under fire because the underlying technology of the desktop was shifting. Will we let this narrative change to games should only be made by professionals? Would we forget the thriving creative space that we once had because we somehow swallowed that games are not meant for this platform? For example, if we remove the platform's accessibility to everyone and swallow the pill that not everyone should make games, that games should only be made by professionals, we surrender creative freedom. Computers are not just meant for consuming entertainment. They are not just outlets for consumption. They are also a space for artists to create weird, amazing, or horrible work. Technology belongs to everyone. I think we should really learn from Flash's history and not let what we have today with indie games fall into the same fate. The type of gentrification that happened on the internet has cost us a lot, and we don't really remember it for how we failed to preserve it. We need to protect the idea that platforms like the desktop should be open to hobbyist developers. There should be many storefronts. Alternatives are good. Write our own history outside the mainstream and capitalist narratives, so we don't forget what we have and get pushed into a more controlled direction for how our expectations got lowered. And that amateur work absolutely belongs. It should be given a space of respect and acknowledged for its importance. When we remember Flash, we remember it for the bad PR, the memes about it blowing its security exploits out or vulnerability out of proportion, the negative hype about it that came from Apple. It's worth acknowledging its contributions to digital culture too. Flash was once a thriving cornerstone to many creative movements on the web. It had reach and was accessible to anyone. Its accessibility was a big reason for the momentum of early internet art and why so much of it caught on. It empowered anyone to make beautiful things and served as a beginning for a lot of creators. And it shaped much of the modern web. It's important to remember that. Flash was special. It made the internet better. Thank you.
Yay, awesome.
Thank you so much, Nathalie. That was really fantastic and interesting.
I think that you draw a really interesting connection, or it's an interesting story that draws in the Flash, net art, and what we could call the indie-pocalypse, or the consolidation of games onto a couple of platforms. And it's really interesting how you can see Flash there at the existing sort of at the near the center of all those stories. I've never really thought of it that way.
Yeah, and I feel like it's also very much shaped or saved our expectations of what we expect from how accessible game development should be, because I feel like without it, we wouldn't have Unity had taken that direction, because a lot of Unity developers, if I remember right, used to be Flash developers. Like people that work at Unity too kind of went to from came from Flash, went to Unity. Like I remember following a few of them, and they were like, "Yeah, I'm working for Unity now." And I feel like because of Flash, we feel like we have a right to create games where that kind of didn't really exist before. Like the idea that with how the Nintendo Wii had, browser that supported Flash, and then you had these hobbyists that were making Wii games, but it was, Flash games in the Wii browser, but they were Wii games. Like it was accessible to everyone. And then, so I feel like that's important to remember, because the fact that we can participate in online and digital culture, it's made possible by accessible tools that let anyone participate.
Right. I like that idea that you said of it not being an assumed thing by people. It reminds me of when you hear about the generation of game developers that started working on games in the 90s. It was very much more that, where there wasn't sort of the idea that anyone could make a game at all, and so you often hear of the people who started making games in the 90s being sort of surprised that they could even get into game making. So it's interesting how the tools can change the way that we think, or maybe better way to put it, they empower us to think about creating the things ourselves. Too bad about all the centralization into these platforms that is doing the opposite.
Yeah.
I recall.
Yeah, that's like a big battle right now, I feel like, is pushing against centralization.
Yeah, which is true, like we were saying, both in terms of the both in terms of the net art, the web platforms, the social media platforms that we use to view the internet through, I feel like is doing something towards standardizing the internet away from thinking of web pages as an art medium, like you were talking about, and more towards just thinking of posts and feeds. And then websites that interface well with the post and the feed, and the same for games, where the like Steam, Google Play Store, and App Store. You're right that we sacrifice a lot by getting rid of a multitude of different storefronts for just 3 big storefronts.
Or I'm trying to bring up a earlier question, but I recall something. I myself didn't have Flash, but of course I played a lot of things or interacted with a lot of things on Flash-based websites, including a lot of the Okaki boards, like the drawing tools, and this is where I found a lot of a huge community, and many that I still keep in contact today with. Just the being able to have access to a computer, but not necessarily to the tools that enable you to create work. But Flash had this function of, all these websites ran off of Flash, the ability to draw and create online without having to have to pay for accessing those tools from Adobe. That was something that, and when that closed down, I remember that being very traumatic, because HTML5 could not support that at the time. It's just something that really resonates. But we do have a audience question from Clara Chen. The presumed dichotomies between art, tech, and sciences set hindrances across our culture in schools, industry, and media. We've seen radical organizations / movements like Bauhaus become known for merging different ways of knowing for design. Flash was an incredible product which naturally merged tech and art. Nathalie, where do you hope / dream / anticipate that net art could become? I think in the context of our current...
Yeah, is there hope for websites as an art medium?
I feel like God, it's hard because I love websites and I still do make them and like insist on making them, even though I feel like also there's a realization that it's a bit of a time sink because Google browser could change something tomorrow and it just doesn't work anymore. It's arbitrary decisions. I feel like right now desktop is the last space where we are free and we can, so if we can work beyond the desktop and push back for how websites can be, maybe there's hope, if we could just create substitutes and get away from social media or create some kind of general awareness that's, social media isn't the way to interact with the web. And, there would have to be more mentality shifts and actual popular discussion happening that you should get away from this mainstream spaces and go back to people spaces, I don't know if that answers the question.
It's also so challenging because, well, if you're thinking of like product funnels or trying to get users to your work, downloading is all downloading / paying for something and installing it on their own computer. That's like the hardest, the fewest number of people who will do that. And it really changed. It's really not the type of actions that are encouraged, like versus just infinitely scrolling on something and just sort of more passively consuming. Actually having to actively download and play something is not part of the user vocabulary, user experience vocabulary that is so prominent.
Yeah, totally. Like with these Flash websites, people used to share them like they were memes. Like interactive work used to be just as easy as sharing images or sound files or whatever, So yeah, it's a really unfortunate shift that happened,
We even find with desktop applications, it's like the Windows and the Apple platforms are becoming more enclosed, where they prompt you to become they prompt you whenever you try to open an app that is not made by an officially recognized developer or whatever, and that's a really difficult thing to get around even when you're trying.
Yeah, even when you're sending it to your mom and you say, "I promise, I made this. It won't give you a virus."
Yeah, and even for the developers, it's an expensive process to be certified and allowed on that system. So it's like the bar is raised to be for larger commercial entities, not just any homebrew person making their shit,
Yeah, John Hampton suggests OBS as an art medium, which is pretty. This does feel very free to be able to just. Or freeing rather, to be able to put up your some fun video art to be making this sort of infinite mirror thing that we're making.
Yeah, for context, OBS, Open Broadcast Software, is what we're using to live stream. So for the audience and what is producing this wonderful infinite mirror. I should have been doing this more through. There we go.
Send a heart down to the infinite.
But yeah, we have a lot of thanks for you, Nathalie, in the chat. People quite enjoyed all those comments, and of course will be saved forever. Thank you. Just lots of positive feedback. Oh, it looks like we have another question here.
So John Hampton says, Xbox Game Pass and the coming wave of game streaming services seems like the most closed version of game development, with the promise of free streaming games, which actually harkens back to Flash. So it's sort of at once you're getting that sort of like not having to download stuff, online-based medium that Flash gives you, but with an even more closed ecosystem.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of like these corporations learned from what we created as people, just our own communities, pushed us out, took it over, and streamlined it in ways that only they control. Like if you look at all of that, it's so douchey. Like, like I feel like if Neopets came out today, it would be revolutionary, and it would be like a new type of social media platform. We use all this stupid current language, and it would be, some kind of streamlined, larger corporation pushing people. Like it's not anymore little people doing it from their garage and building their own community and world now. Yeah, I'm off on a tangent, but yeah, totally. It's like people seem to constantly get pushed out of their own spaces that they create.
Yeah, that's seems to be a feature, not a bug of the current system. But we really appreciate to have you on today, Nathalie. Thank you so much for providing so much more insight about Flash. Really. Oh,
Yeah,
great.
do you want to throw? Oh, yeah, we have one more question, but just would you please throw the slide you have of all your socials and links back up, just for so people are
Yeah.
able to start following you on all those platforms? Awesome. Oh, and we'll just move your head. There we go. So it doesn't block it. Awesome. And from Neil, we have a question. When connection speeds increased for streaming graphics, is it possible that we could all stream our own art off our own home machines? Do we need scale services like Amazon Web Service servers for things enjoyed by small audiences? Can Raspberry Pi save us? Thank you for your talk. That's
Yes.
great.
Raspberry Pi and Ruffle and all these little things. They're so important.
Yeah.
You know, the Ruffle substitute player, like, I feel like that's really cool and very hopeful, future and direction.
Mm-hmm.
Ruffles. I forgot. I have to look it up. I never had to say it out loud because I've been quarantined for too long and haven't been talking to people.
Yes, I feel the same way. Forgetting my words. Yeah, we'll have. I think we were talking about that a bit on the last panel talk, as being a good sort of like emulation tool, and we'll be looking at more ways, of course, to overcome the limitations of obsolescence in our upcoming workshop with Clara Chen, who's in the chat, about how to archive your websites, including your Flash websites, using the Conifer software, which is sort of a similar thing to Ruffle in some ways. I think it's in that it can emulate the Flash environment once you record or archive software with it, and that'll be happening. That workshop is
next week, so also on Thursday, but at 7 p.m. CST, and it will also be live streamed. But if you're interested in actually following along with the process, we recommend that you actually register. You can register. Maybe I can throw that at mackenzie.art. Let's throw that link down in the chat in the online classes and workshops section. So that will allow us then to actually like work with you. Yes, we're posting the link in the chat, or for Clara to work with you on saving your favorite Flash websites for later. And so that's next week, Thursday, 7 p.m. CST. There it is in the chat. But for the although we are coming to our at the end of the streaming time tonight. Thank you so much, Nathalie, for your participation and just your presentation. It was so fantastic to have, like, you've been in the game for so long that it's just getting your insight is really incredible. We do have we are streaming back to back with another Flash featured Flash focused programming series. This one coming from Baby Castles out of New York. I actually don't know how to raid in Twitch, but through Restream. But we'll post the link to that, which will be happening starting in a couple minutes on their Twitch account, and we'll post that in the chat so people can follow along. I believe people are playing some of their favorite Flash games and talking about them online. But all that said, thank you so much, Nathalie, for tonight.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was fun.
okay. Goodbye, everybody. Have a good night.